All right, we continuing today in our series of lectures on the evolvements of prayer. Last time we spoke about the Sephardic evolvement, and again, this is not a thorough lecture, and this is just to give you maybe some tidbits for you to, if you're interested in doing some more and further research on that. For me, it's fascinating, and it has nothing to do with being Sephardi or being Ashkenazi. It has to do with being a Jew and understanding where things came about. So today we're going to talk about what is known as Nusach Ashkenaz, the Ashkenazic style or form of prayer, which is the form which is accepted by some of the Jews, those who came from the what we call Ashkenaz countries, and we'll say exactly what it is. So that Nusach Tefillah, that form of prayer of the Ashkenazic Jews, really stem from or came from Germany. The Jews called Germany Ashkenaz, and it really is mainly based on the some kind of a combination between the Gaonic form of prayer to the Eretz Israeli, the land of Israel form of the ancient one. There's a more modern one, but the ancient one, and they made some kind of a combination together. And that unification really stems, or really you could already see it in the Italian form of prayer, which they had their own. There in Italy also there were different methods. God willing, we're going to get to it, in the future. Just to mention, there was Rome, there was Sicily, Sardinia, and so on. And so different formulas for prayer, and slowly, Nusach Ashkenaz was influenced by the Halachic decisions of the Ashkenazic poskim, or the Ashkenazic Halachic authorities. During the Middle Ages, there were many differences in the form of prayer between one community to the other. And the final form or format of prayer really started to establish themselves much later into history, when people started to use printed Sidurim. And as we mentioned before, that's exactly what happened with the Sfaradim, when the Sidurim became more popular. Now everybody puts his own Sidur, everybody allows himself to change here and there, and this is exactly what happens in Ashkenaz as well. Same thing has happened in the Sfaradim. It's a interesting development as it is. And especially when the Ashkenazic Jews started to migrate from Germany towards Eastern Europe, they brought they brought the Ashkenazic formula or format of prayer. It usually happens when a dominant group moves to one place to another, a very advanced group moves from one place to another. Many times that becomes, even though there could be a minority, but that becomes the dominant cultural group that really influences and changes that. And that's exactly what happened. There were Jews in Eastern Europe, but they were not as advanced as the Jews that came from Germany. So as those came, in terms of, and I'm talking about advanced in terms of culture, in terms of language, in terms of halacha, so they became more dominant, and they bestow their influence on the rest of the communities that they came about. But of course, there were other changes that occurred in the Eastern countries. They were evolved differently than it was evolved in Western Europe, and around the 14th century, there were three main branches of Nusach Ashkenaz. There was the Western branch, which was really was dominant in places like Western Germany and so on and so forth, and that was called Nusach Rhinus, the Rhinus or the Rhine format, and the main branch or the central branch that was called Minhag Saxonia, the Saxonian format, and from that, really the format of Eastern Europe was evolved. Like for example, Poland, and in that, and you see it a lot, by the way, in Ashkenazic prayers, you see it a lot when they do slichot. So there's Minhag Lita, Minhag Galicia, and so on and so forth. It's really different. Of course, unfortunately, because of the war, a lot of the German Jews, a lot of European Jews, but a lot of German Jews perished, and other places became more dominant. But really, at the time, Ashkenaz or the Yekis were they were the power to, as they said, to reckon with. They were the most dominant. Once they went down, the other groups went up, and we're not talking about Hasidim as well. And of course, we said the eastern branch that was that really was more common in places like Eastern Germany and Austria, and that was called the Oestrich format. Around the 15th century, those differences between the Saxonian format and the Oestrich had been erased, of course, also because of a lot of political and military campaigns and so on and so forth, and then it became more dominant to have the Eastern format and then the Western format. So that's what it was. Listen, there were many other countries that had their own formats of tefillah, for example, France and so on, but really because of disappearing of many communities and downfall of many communities, mainly because of war and persecutions, we kind of tend to forget that they existed altogether. I mean, if you think today about Italian format of tefillah, most people don't even know what it is. And there was time that was the main branch. Today we think only Sephardim, Ashkenazim, and Nusach Sfard. But you need to understand where we came from, and even today you start to see some changes in different places. Now, in the regular format, there's what we call Minhag Austriach, and later on, which is called Minhag Poling, the Polish format. And there were very few differences between Nusach Ashkenaz the West to the Nusach Ashkenaz East. But regarding, as we said, regarding poems that would enter later on, or poetic essays that will later on enter the Siddur, that's where you see most of the difference. And especially, as we said, during Slichot, when they say, or during certain occasions like, Tisha B'Av or Sarah, all those fast days, there are many differences. What I don't like about, for me it's fascinating, and maybe I'm about to say something most people are not going to appreciate, but won't be the first time, is you really see that a lot of the Siddurim, what we call Tefillah, at the time was very flexible when they actually put in religious poetry. Whether it's, in Spain, Rabbi Yehuda Levi, Rabbi Shlomo Ibn Gavirol, or in Ashkenaz, which we're going to talk about, the Kalir and maybe Yeni or whatever it is that they put in, this is like religious poetry that made itself into the Siddur, to the point that today we say this is, Yehareg V'Bal Ya'avor, you can't even change anything. And I want to see anybody today writing a religious poetry and trying to put it into the Siddur, you get stoned to death. Right? A lot of those songs that we sing, Adon Olam Asher Malach, right? Oh, Yigdal Elohim Chai, right? Oh, this is poetry. Many shuls today on Friday, if you don't sing Yigdal, it's like, it's like you didn't say Aleinu L'Shabeach, I don't know, something like that. Or Adon Olam, depends what it is. Certain places, they took it out. By the Ashkenazim, there is a very interesting song, it's called Shira Kavod. Right? Shir HaKavod, many places they sing it at the end of Tefillah. They go right after Aleinu. They go, and I've seen it. They go to the Aron Kodesh. They open Aron Kodesh, and then they sing Shir HaKavod. And usually it goes like a back and forward between the Chazan and the congregation. Certain places in Israel, especially the Bnei Akiva, when they open the Hechal to take the Sefer Torah out, they open the Hechal and the whole congregation sings Shir HaKavod. It's like very strange. In the Yeshivish world, they took it out completely. They said, oh, that's not a part of tefillah, just a song. They took it out completely. They don't have it. So, what I want to tell you is, I guess prayer is not so set in stone. Today it is, but really isn't. Because, they did change. They did change a lot. They took things, they formatted things changed, things evolved. So, for me to say that, or to think that this verse or this format is superior to the other, I think it's quite questionable. It's not about the actual words. I think it's more about the intent of your heart, or who you are as a person that actually vocalizing those words. If you're asking me, but I guess nobody's asking me, so we're going to continue with this. Now, also during the Chagim, there are many differences between the two, right? And like, for example, if you talk about the most of Germany and most of Western Europe, the main factor to determine is the minhagim of the Maharil, what he brought into light, and the other one, which is in Central and Eastern Europe, is really based more on the minhagim of Rabbi Yitzchak or Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac from Tirna, and really for the past 100 years, the boundaries became the Alba River, right? This east of the river, west of the river. But during the Middle Ages, it was more Western than it is actually today. However, after the Hasidus movement had came about and really connected what we call Nusach Sfarad added Nusach Sfarad instead of Nusach Ashkenaz, the Nusach Ashkenaz was not the only, he didn't have how do you call it, an exclusive, rights on Ashkenazic to some daven Nusach Sfarad. Of course, there are poskim like Rav Moshe Feinstein. Then he asked about if a person is allowed to switch from Nusach Ashkenaz to Nusach Sfarad, or vice versa. And Rav Moshe says that no, Nusach Ashkenaz is the one, and therefore a person can always switch from Nusach Sfarad to Nusach Ashkenaz because that's what they did, but should not switch from Nusach Ashkenaz to the Nusach Sfarad, in other words, the Hasidic form, to do that. Very interesting. I mean, we become very tight about things like that. And of course, there's a Halachic basic to that. Mishum lo titosh Torah imecha. In other words, you should clinch to your heritage and don't start jumping around. Once you start jumping around, you end up doing nothing. So that's basically the idea behind it. So in Eastern Europe, there were even more divisions, or more, and they were quite severe between the different formats of tefillah, and mainly because of the Hasidim and the Mitnagdim. So that also caused, and almost in all the major communities, that was a big issue. Hasidim versus Mitnagdim. So this one tried to initiate, no, we are who have the proper tefillah, the other one is the proper tefillah, and so on and so forth. And you could really see it in the way the shuls were run, the synagogues were run. So in big cities, where they had big shuls, they mainly stayed, or they stuck to the Nusach Ashkenaz, which the old Nusach Ashkenaz, and the new community, which sometimes the Hasidim, which many times were the majority of the Kehillah, used to make their own small shuls, or what we call shtibelach, right? And over there, they daven Nusach Sfarad, and you see it today. I mean, you have places that with, $3 million houses, but they have a Hasidic shul that, they have mahogany, Aron Kodesh and everything like this, and they still call it the Shtibelach. It's kind of, I don't know. I davened in Shtibalach before, and there was nothing like we have today. But I guess everybody likes comfort and everybody likes to feel important and so on and so forth. But that's really where it came from. They would make a bet medrash and they'll daven in a bet medrash, or they make a small little shack and they call it a Shtibalach, and then they do Nusach Sfarad. But the main shuls were all Nusach Ashkenaz. However, the Nusach Ashkenaz that was mainly the exclusive in in Western and Central Europe, at least until World War I. You see, wars always have to do with changing even the structure and the infrastructure of our communities, and even the way we do things, whether we'd like to acknowledge it or not. So all of a sudden, a lot of immigrants, which were mainly Hasidic immigrants, came from Eastern Europe. They start traveling towards Western Europe, start traveling to Germany, and so on and so forth. And many Jewish immigrants from Europe to America, to the New World, whether it's the United States, Mexico, Canada, Argentina, and places like that. It was the New World. People went on like this. And even places like Australia or South Africa. And depends where the majorities, they established their Nusach as the dominant Nusach of this place. So in South Africa, you might have more Hasidic Rav versus then Hasidim, or followers like that, and that really reflects how they pray and what's the more dominant format of tefillah in this place. And in those places, the Hasidim, or like real so-called true Hasidim, or came from very distinctive Hasidic family, they wanted to establish their shuls, and that's the minhag of the city. And still, they had, it was more accessible to have Ashkenaz Sidurim. So it was a quite interesting, shifting of how do we actually do that. I mean, to print the Sidurim in Eastern Europe was a very expensive thing. So depends what they had the more. And this is, by the way, you see it a lot also even in the Reform and conservative Sidurim that are really influenced from that changes as well. They took from here a little bit, they took from there a little bit, and so on and so forth. And that's why Nusach Ashkenaz, because of the accessibility of Sidurim and so on, in most countries is, by the Ashkenazim, is the dominant. Yes, there's Nusach Sfarad, but there's much more Nusach Ashkenaz than there's Nusach Sfarad. However, in Eretz Israel, Nusach Sfarad of the Hasidim is what many of the Ashkenazim daven. It's just fascinating how it happened, and mainly because many of the institutions, where they learn and education and so on and so forth, use that. In Israel, there is what's it called Mamlachti Dati, which is a government-run public education that is religious. That's what they use over there. The Hasidic Nusach Sfard. Their idea behind it was also, by making Nusach Sfard more dominant in Israel, they'll be able to benefit from all words. Why? They'll take the Ashkenazim and they'll be able to grab in the Sfardim. Rabbi Ovadia was against it. Rabbi Ovadia says you should not do that. Right? Now, with the 11, with the involvement of the development of what's going on in Israel, there's also another change in terms of that. So in Israel itself, so the Ashkenazic format, which is the most accepted in Israel, is really the format of the Nusach Ashkenaz, call it East. I guess it's always East versus West somehow. And why is that? Because the first Ashkenazic Jews that came in masses, again, that's something that we need to remember, we need to address. Until the masses of migration of Jews back into Israel from Eastern Europe, the majority of the Jews in Israel were Sephardic Jews. Also because it was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire was always at war with the European, with Germany, with Austria, and so on and so forth. Therefore, they did not allow any citizens from those countries to migrate into the Ottoman Empire, in concern that there would be spies and they would undermine that. So they really limited the ability of Jews to come from Europe into Israel. There was not a problem for Sephardic Jews to be there because they were Ottoman citizens, so therefore they were allowed to do so. The kindness of Sephardic Jews to Ashkenazic Jews is that they accepted them in, and they actually gave them the dressing. When they somehow were able to manage themselves to get to Israel, they wore all the Sephardic regila. In other words, they had the kaftan on, the jacket on, and so on and so forth. So much it became that you see it today. Many of those they call them in like a derogatory nickname, the zebras. You know, the Hasidic Toldot Aaron. When you go to Yerushalayim, you see those people that wear these long dresses and the long kaftan with stripes on. This is how the Jews, the Sephardic Jews used to dress all the time. We forgot, and they still kept it, which is very interesting. Today it became Hasidic, but its roots in Sephardic clothing. They did not allow this to happen. So the Sephardic Jews saw the Ashkenazic brothers coming in, and they allowed them to settle down. So the first one to really make this initiative to move were those who followed the Gra, the Gaon Vilna, and he was from Vilna is in Lita, in Latvia. So they came in, and that became the dominant form of tefillah. And when the Talmidim of the Gra reached Eretz Israel, as we said, most of them were Sfaradim. So since the halacha determines the following, and you could see it in in Avkat Rochel, written by the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch says the following: that when you are coming into a new place, you must accept upon yourself the traditions of the people who are already established there for the integrity of the community. That did not really happen in Israel. They came in. They thought that if they're going to adapt Nusach Sfard, that will be somewhat. Where listen to this, really halachically, they violated the halacha by changing the Nusach. They all should have become so-called Sfaradim. And that is how we got the glut issue and the halak meat, the kasher. Until that point, there was no such thing. The shechita in Eretz Israel was all based according to Sephardic standards, which is higher than Ashkenazic standards, which is a different sugya altogether, which hopefully maybe one day we'll talk about. But that was their adaptation to that, and they changed some of the differences they had from Nusach Ashkenaz, and they form it more to the Nusach of the Sfaradim in Israel. For example, saying Hallel at Pesach night in Shul, right? In Pesach and the night of Leila Seder, when we daven Arvit, the Sfaradim say Hallel in Bet HaKnesset, the Ashkenazim don't. Those who were the followers of the Gra in Eretz Israel adopted that minhag as well. Or saying, for example, Enke Elokeinu, they say it also, or Pitu Maktoret every single day. All of a sudden, you find it in Ashkenazic Siddurim as well, right?
Birkat Kohanim also.
Birkat Kohanim, you're right, Birkat Kohanim as well. Yes, that was a big thing for Hasidei Agra to do Birkat Kohanim. Or saying, for example, Morid Atal in the summer, or saying Bamim Madlikim in Kabbalat Shabbat before Arvit, and not after that, like the Ashkenazim do. And really many more. Now, some of those who came from Ashkenaz and Eretz Israel did not accept those minhagim, and according and in recent years there were more what they call minhag Ashkenazi Yashan, the old Ashkenazic thing that the people actually start to establish in Israel. You see it also regarding regarding what we call the Dati Leumi, their Nusach is a little bit more Nusach Sfard oriented than the actual Nusach Ashkenaz, those Srugi Kippah, the people that go like that. So it's fascinating, and that's what I'm saying. It keeps on evolving all the time. Now, while a main thing is also the difference between the Sephardic and Ashkenazi is the saying of piyutim. Piyutim is, let's call it religious poetry. So most Sephardic Jews really did not accept upon themselves those poets to live in Israel, the ancient Israel at the time, like the Kalir or Yeni and so on and so forth. The Ashkenazi Jews accept them. The Ari said that they should accept it also. That's one thing that the Ari said that they should change, and the Sephardic Jews did not listen to him when he came to that. And even later on, other poets, much later poets in Ashkenaz, wrote poetry was using the same format. Now, in regards of saying those piyutim, there is a substantial difference not only between Eastern and Western Europe, but also between the different communities that were set in those parts between the Eastern and Western, So it would seem like almost any other city in Europe had its own way of saying piyutim, or saying special poetry like this. But really, because of historical factors, like for example, migration to the New World, making printable books much more accessible, religious reform, or even making changes in the length of tefillah, because it just did not seem to fit our daily schedule in terms of going to work and so on and so forth. Events like the Holocaust, events like the State of Israel. So all those, all these minhagim almost disappeared. You would find more different minhagim like that in the United States than you will find them in Israel. In the United States, again, take the Machzor Yom Kippur, for example, Art School puts, and I just love Art School for what they do. They do an amazing job, and everything they do is just great. So, but it's nice. You see all of a sudden Minhag Galicia, Minhag Lita, Minhag Poland, Minhag this, Minhag that, and it's totally different things. In America, you would see it. In Israel, you don't see those things. In Israel, it's very hard to see those differences. In most of the communities, there's like a universal form of those piyutim, and you would find it again because of Nusach Ashkenaz. You find it. So there is in Slichot, again, there are more differences, but regarding piyutim, it's more like Ashkenaz, and sometimes you still find the difference between Eastern Europe to Western Europe. Most of the communities that pray in this Nusach, you'll see that they really omit a lot of those piyutim that they said in Ashkenaz, and very, very few places they say it, especially if they are, believe it or not, sometimes because of a survival mode, certain communities, especially Yekis. Yekis used to be, for example, a big community in the United States itself. They have the Kaladat Yeshurun. They were in Washington Heights. They were in Kew Gardens. They were in Muncie. There were a lot of Yekis. A very, very fine community. They were in Jackson Heights. And the American Ashkenazic, not only Ashkenazic, but Ashkenazic community went through a sudden transformation with the strengthening of the yeshivot and really establishing communities like Lakewood. They kind of erased everything out, because what happened is all the young people, let's say you had a pristine yeshiva like Lakewood, so everybody wants to be a part of the pristine yeshiva, so everybody went to Lakewood. So all the young people went to Lakewood, and they never came back to their communities. You end up with old people, very few stayed, few went to Florida, and the rest of them died, and then they fall apart. Together with those people, all those traditions have gone. So besides, few communities still follow that and they understand, you would not find those piyutim and those ways of prayer anywhere anymore. Today we have what is so-called, we daven yeshivish. What is really yeshivish? And there's no more yekis. And I mean, you go, without getting into the tunes and what really was, I mean, you should know that there were times in history that they actually had notes printed because they, listen, it's not like the Sephardi davening, because the Sephardi davening is really influenced from, Eastern form of music, which is really works on half tones and stuff like this. You can't really write those down. You can't write, it's more about improvisation, and we call it makam. But the Ashkenazic or European was really influenced a lot from, classical music. Waltzes, you'll find a lot of the time into this, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, You'll find a lot of marches, depends where you are. So if it's Polish, you'll find more like a march, tunes into the music. Where it's German, you'll find more like classical, influences on it, whether it's Bach or Handel, and so on and so forth. So they were actually making notes. Today, there is such thing that's called yeshivish, and yeshivish is like a new thing that who knows where it's going to take us and how it's going to evolve from this point on. It's nice because you can go somewhere and it's the same thing, but together with that, you lose a lot of this character, and it's really, really a shame that we lose those characters, and it's really a shame that the young people that do go to places like this really sentence their own communities to death. Communities are really dwindling down because the young people not moving in, and they simply disappear. Everybody wants this big house in Tom River and Jackson, Jackson, New Jersey, and Lakewood, and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, everything is emptying out. Young people don't move there. Communities die. Minhagim die. Minhagim being erased, and so on. And it's really a shame. That's the beauty that we have as Jewish people, is the complete diversity, and yet understanding that we're all brothers. And we should really understand that there's, again, no superior prayer. There's no superior minhag. This is all, the diversity of the minhagim is our strength. And we should acknowledge that and celebrate the difference, and not try to uniform everything into one mold, because then there's no room for self-expression and self-emotion in prayer and so on. And that's a terrible thing. Because then people would say, you know what, I just can't connect to it. So guess what? There's nowhere for me to go. I'm out of here. And it starts with tefillah. It starts with tefillah. So there are some communities, as we said, that keeps doing that. I would challenge you to really, let's finish the Chagim, the high holidays, because that's you really get lost if you go to a different Nusach. If you're an Ashkenaz going to Sephardi, or Sephardi going to an Ashkenaz, or going both of you to Hasidic, you're not gonna find your hands and legs. But I would encourage you to go, the best of your abilities, depends where you live, to different shuls, to see different synagogues, to see actually how they pray. Because after all, they still are our brothers. Doesn't make a difference if they're davening and it sounds like Joseph Handel, or Johann Sebastian Bach, or it sounds like Kulthum or Farid El-Atrash, right? It's your brothers, it's a part of you. You should go there and celebrate it, and celebrate your heritage, because it is your heritage as well. It's what we call a Jewish heritage, Jewish culture, and we should learn it. So I would encourage you to do that. When I'm in Israel, I like to go to different synagogues, to different shuls. I used to love to go to, let's say, Yemenite Baladi, prayers, even though that sometimes I had a hard time understanding what in the world they're saying. But it was a statement that I'm a Jew and I celebrate the diversity, rather than trying to make everybody like me, because I'm not quite sure that that's a good idea. The diversity is important. So when you go there, when you go to different shuls, go like on a trip. Because if you're able to go to a shul, let's say for example you find a Yeki shul somewhere, go see how they daven, go listen to their tunes, listen how to do things. You've seen yeshivish already one too many times. So go to a different shul that they have, that is still authentic. Then go to Young Israel, then go to Moroccan shul, go to Yemenite shul. I'm not saying you have to fall in love with all of them, but you should. At least open your ears, and maybe when you go and understand that regardless of how they sound, they're all praying to the same God that we all pray, and we all came from the same mother and father, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah. These are weird. It's all our flesh and blood. Maybe when you're able to train your ear to hear different prayers, you will also train your heart to accept other people. Have a wonderful day.